family. We're back here at the People's TV, and my name is Brother Mark. I'm one of the co-hosts, and this is the show. As you can see, we got it working from a new studio, from our brand new studio here. So we put the banner up for the People-Pueblo Party because that's the group that produces this show. And the People-Pueblo Party believes in common sense politics for the people, the planet, and the animals, because it's all linked together. And also, we're sponsored by the People's Health Project Incorporated, which tries to help people with their eating, with their stress level, and trying to so we could have a better and longer life experience. And so tonight, we're going to start our show with a few minutes talking about COVID and its connection to war, right? And then we're going to get into our main topic, which is reparations. But before we move on to that, I want to bring my co-host and let him say what's up. Okay, so he'll be on right now. There you go. Hey, brother, how you doing? Everything good?
Yeah, I'm fine. I feel like Snow White. I wonder why. How much snow did y'all get?
Actually, I don't even know. I just know it started snowing yesterday, then it stopped, and then it looked like it was going to rain. And then all of a sudden, we got a whole bunch of snow again today. So it's like the snow that don't stop.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm glad. I hope everybody's safe and sound. My son just left with his girlfriend. Her mother moved to Connecticut, was in a car accident. They towed the car and left her stranded.
Wow.
I just pray that it doesn't compound things, So say a prayer for them because nobody should be out. She got 4-wheel drive. She got a Jeep.
Right.
So we'll see what happens.
All right. All
But
right.
he's a descendant of a warrior, and that's what we do, you know?
Yeah.
So straight ahead with that. It's good to
Right.
be here. Good to be dealing with the issues, the day-to-day issues that's like the snow. Like they say, you never know how much snow, how long it's going to last. This cry for reparation, the war, literally and figurative war that we fighting is still persistent. And it's apropos, when you tied in with the snow, you know,
Yeah.
some things don't change.
All right. So we're gonna go on with the show. Were you able to check out that first video on COVID and war?
Yeah. Yeah. I just think I was listening to it. I
Well,
was
let me play it so everybody else can listen
okay.
to it. Then,
Okay.
then we'll get into it.
Okay.
So hold
Yeah.
that thought. Hold that thought.
Okay. All right. Let's do it.
All right.
Yeah, I just want to what, of course, Kathleen was talking about with Janet Yellen. In fact, it's not just Janet Yellen, but it's other picks from Biden for his cabinet who are kind of saying that to a certain degree. They agree with the Trump administration's stance on China, whether it's Janet Yellen, the Treasury pick, or Antony Blinken, who is going to be the Secretary of State, or also Avril Haines, I should say, who's going to be the Director of National Intelligence, all to a certain degree agreeing with some of the stances that the Trump administration has taken on China. Of course, Biden's big task on China is to decide whether to continue down this road of the executive actions that the Trump administration has taken in the waning days of its term, and that is, of course, executive orders on companies that they believe are linked to the Chinese military, whether it's from Sinuk to Xiaomi. Of course, there's the Huawei big saga, and of course the tariffs as well. Over 4 years, the Trump administration has levied tariffs on some 350 billion plus US dollars worth of Chinese goods. So what is going to be the Biden stance? Now, he has indicated that that's not going to be an immediate priority to unwind those tariffs or unwind some of the executive orders, but we don't know, right? He has indicated, of course, in the debate, which what people say in the debate does not necessarily equate to what they're going to do in policy. But of course, he did liken Trump's policies of embracing thugs, his words, like the leaders of North Korea, like the leaders of China, and Russia, and that he would make China play by the international rules. So what is Janet Yellen saying? Well, you just heard about the renminbi, but she also talked about China is undercutting American companies by dumping products and erecting trade barriers, giving illegal subsidies to corporations, stealing IP, engaging in practices that give it an unfair and technological advantage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you know, these next few weeks or perhaps few months of the Biden administration could be telling on how they are going to tackle the China situation.
And we heard earlier from Antony Blinken as well, of course, the Secretary of State nominee, and Joe Biden saying that they'd take a different approach to North Korea. We also heard Mike Pompeo just lobbying sort of another attack on Beijing, calling the situation when it comes to the treatment of the Uyghur population as ongoing genocide. Is that likely to be consistently carried over, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because we're hearing that there is growing bipartisan support in Congress for tougher action on China for its handling and its actions in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs. And I guess you could call it perhaps Mike Pompeo's final parting shot at China. He did designate what is happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghur minorities as genocide. And interestingly, you mentioned Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State, in his confirmation hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He is essentially agreeing with Mike Pompeo, saying that it is genocide that is happening and that there needs to be more unified action to hold China to account.
Let me bring Bill on here. So basically, Bill, what you already saw this video, but I'm just going to recap a little bit. You know, they were talking about all these people that Biden appointed are now saying the same things that the Trump appointees were saying about China and, you know, and about tariffs that you have to continue. We have to get China under control. And, you know, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's certain key points. One is that, you know, it was the U.S. government that decided to send, and the U.S. corporations that decided to send all the factory jobs in the United States to China. China did not force the United States government or the companies here to send all those good-paying union jobs to China so they could exploit the Chinese workers. And then number two, that now Biden's people are talking about Uyghur genocide when they won't recognize the genocide of Native people and Black people and other people in this country. So, you know, we're going to touch on this briefly because I think it segues directly into the whole issue of reparations. You know, how Biden's appointed people are talking about genocide in China when they won't deal with genocide here in the United States. What you think, Bill?
It's a great segue because all you're talking about, first of all, they're saying that now the narrative is they're going to teach China a lesson, basically. That's what they're really saying. And I remember when they started sending the jobs overseas, you know, and inferior product, and they were getting money off of it, and the pendulum started to change. Once you give somebody a foothold and they start to see how it works, eventually the tide's going to change, and they're going to use, I mean, whether you use the you learned or what have you, and they're going to use that information that they got. And when you talk about genocide, I mean, the United States of all people, how dare them use that word when they're oldest. I say this all the time. I say a couple things redundantly. Follow the money is one of them, and the other thing, America's oldest crime is the enslavement of African American people. And they have never corrected that. And when you talk about genocides, or you talk about reparations or whatever, you're talking about somebody that's paid for past sins and things of that nature. So yeah, I agree with you. And even go one step further, you look at what Biden's done in his first 2 weeks and whatnot. He's not done anything for African American people of color. The only thing that he's done is through a smoke screen is he talked about putting Harriet Tubman back on the $20 bill so that the rock you to sleep. make you think you're doing they're doing something when they really not. And then if they do agree with it, it'll be 7 years before or whatever, 5 years before they even do that.
Yeah, but you know what I heard on that?
So it's pretty much
on that $20 bill. He's going to put Harriet Tubman in the front, but he's going to put a statue of Andrew Jackson in the back, who was a slave owner and responsible for the Trail of Tears, where they forced Native Americans off their land and put them on reservations. So that's like, okay, y'all get the front of it, but behind it is what we really think. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that epitomizes the statement, watch your back, right? She wanted to be on the front of any building. She had that racist behind them, probably a rapist and all that too. And I think that they had mentioned that earlier on as a compromise. So, you know, a compromise, a crisscross, whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing. People cannot start getting complacent and settling on victory. Sometimes you do, but something you got to stand firm on. And I mean, that's a compromise. I mean, if you want to go there, even go, it's always a compromise. When do you stop compromising? I mean, it's so many things you could talk about, even with the $2 bill with John Hanson on the back of the $2 bill, the first president of the United States. And even with that, with the realization and the admonition, or the admonishment of them admitting that, when you see pictures of them, they Caucasianize them. They change his whole appearance. It just never stopped. At some point in time, you guys put your feet in the ground and plant your feet and say no and insist on it. Biden talked about how much help he thanked to me, he played the antithesis of Trump. Trump knows that Black people didn't feel him. He even before he even ran for president, and Southern Barack Obama, no matter how you might feel about him, I have my feelings about him as well. But say that where's your birth certificate, but you don't want to come up with anything, your tax statements, always talking about your lawyer, and things of that nature. So, and with the handle the Black Lives Matter. So he wanted to tell Black people how much he loves them and how he hits the podium and how we couldn't have done it without you. Thank heavens for the Black American. But then you don't do nothing for him. So, So
welcome, Roger. We're just wrapping up this segment so we can get into reparations. So we just did a short segment on war. This is our Stop COVID segment. But there's, Biden is coming in with a war agenda against China, Russia, Venezuela. And, Joe Kay just put up a comment, says Democrats accuse Trump of being a fascist. If that's true, then Trump was conducting a fascist foreign policy, which the Democrats now support. And another area, because this is our Stop COVID segment, we have to connect it back to COVID. And the issue is that one of the things that the U.S. is trying to use against China is that China created COVID in a lab. And so it's a Chinese virus. Trump used to say that all the time. And somebody was talking to me and said, yeah, but they're saying that these variants are coming out of a lab. And I said, well, listen, there's no variant in Cuba. There's no variant in Australia. There's no variant in New Zealand. There's no new variant in Vietnam. There's no new variant in South Korea. The only places where these new variants are coming from is countries that have not controlled the virus and are letting it go out of control. And they're strictly depending on vaccines, which are going to make billions and billions of dollars for the pharmaceutical companies. So the idea that because there's variants that came out of a lab in China is ridiculous. And as a high school teacher, I keep telling y'all, right? Don't listen to garbage. Pick up a book, break open the book, right? Or get the audio book and listen to it. How to Survive a Pandemic by Dr. Michael Greger. It explains to you why these viruses are appearing, right? And so I'm going to end tonight's Stop COVID segment by letting you know that Biden and Trump and all these people, they want to control the world. They want war with Russia. They want war with China. They want to be the dominant power. They want to keep being the dominant power. And they'll use whatever excuse, whether it's COVID, whether it's human rights that are violated in this country every day. Can you imagine the United States talking about genocide someplace else? So on that note, I want to introduce our guest, Brother Roger Wareham from the December 12th movement, and his organization is in the forefront of fighting for reparations for African Americans, Africans in America. And so I'm just going to let him say a few words, and then we're going to move on with the conversation. Brother Roger, the floor is yours.
What's up, Raj?
Good evening. What's happening, man? Okay, so you're just throwing me right into it. As Mark,
just as an intro, and then I'm going to show a short clip from Dr. King where he talks about, he doesn't use the word reparations, but is so close to it.
It's everything he says except right.
Yes.
Right. So it's very, very, very simply, reparations are due to African people in the United States because we had crimes against humanity committed against us. And for those who aren't aware, it's known as the transatlantic slave trade. And then we were enslaved for several hundred years. We were worked for free. We were sold for a profit, and we were damaged. And when you're damaged, you have to be repaired. And so they owe us a debt, and that's what reparations is about. There's a debt that was owed. It wasn't given. It wasn't provided to our ancestors, but we still suffer from the damage that was caused. And it's been a continuum from the time they brought us over here. And therefore, reparations are due. It's very simple. It's a very easy, it's very simple concept. And you see it applied all around the world, except when it comes to Black people. When it comes to Black people, all of a sudden it gets kind of mysterious and hazy, and it becomes undoable. And so we're here to dispel the mist, clarify the situation, and organize to demand for reparations. So one of the things that we'll talk about probably a little later is the campaign that we have for President Biden to issue an executive order for a $50 billion down payment for reparations.
All right, thank you. So right now I want to add in the stream. This is a little clip. It's like 2 minutes that we showed before. But when, I was talking to Brother Bill about reparation, I was like, you know what? This is so appropriate. We got to play this again. So I'm just going to play this piece, and then we'll be able to discuss some more. And then finally, because I'm always telling people to read, we have a written piece that documents how Ronald Reagan signed reparations for the Japanese when they were in the internment camps. So this whole thing of reparations is nothing new.
I know all of you are studying hard and you're just doing fine in school, and I'm glad to see you.
In the last 2 months of his life, Dr. King faced the idea that civil rights alone could not solve the problem of poverty.
In Mississippi today. Okay, thank you for doing it. Thank you.
He roamed the South, trying to gain support for Poor People's Campaign. Its goals: full employment, a guaranteed income, and decent housing for every American.
People just don't know, but it's really hard. Not only me, it's so many more in the same shape. I'm not the only one. It's just so many of us right around. It's just no have shoes, clothes. They're naked and hungry. Part time you have to cook your children pinto beans morning, down, and supper. They don't know what else get a good meal.
You all are really to be admired. And I want you to know that you have my moral support. I'm going to be praying for you. I'm going to be coming back to see you. And we are going to be demanding, when we go to Washington, that something be done, and done immediately, about these conditions. Yes.
This was a different Martin Luther King. Just weeks before his murder, in tones suggestive of the Black Panthers, he began to talk about how the government had broken its promise to the newly freed slaves just after the Civil War.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Okay, so I think that, I mean, he didn't use the word reparations, but I think that's a resounding endorsement of what you were talking about earlier, Roger. What do you think?
Right, right. He didn't have to. He didn't have to use the word reparations. You know, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But it was very clear. He said, "We come to get our check. You owe us. You owe us." And then there's another statement he made someplace else where he talks about, "You issued us a check which came back marked insufficient funds."
Insufficient funds.
That's right. So he was very clear about that. You know, like we were saying last week on the King Day celebration, they only portray the parts of King which basically they think will help them maintain the status quo. The parts of King, the revolutionary parts, the radical parts of King, they don't want you to know about. So it's why it's important that this program and then the type of demonstrations that we have are very important in terms of educating people to what's going on, because they just disappear all part of history that will really help us to understand the situation we live in, the nature of the country we live in, what the essence of capitalism is, and why we have to fight it.
So the next piece I just want to bring up real quick, and it's I picked it up from this article from Vox, and I usually don't think Vox is a very reliable source, but this time around, somebody there, this person named Dylan Matthews, on May 23rd, did a really excellent. He did his research. And he talks about the Japanese internment, the forced internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans in camps during World War II, resulted in about a $3.1 billion in property loss and $6.4 billion in income loss, right, in 2014 dollars, right? So because the Japanese were interned, they were put in these concentration camps in the United States. They then, Congress made 2 attempts at reparations, the Japanese American Claims Act, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And so they didn't get back all of what they deserved, of what was taken from them. But by 1998, 80,000 survivors had collected their share for a total payout of $1.6 billion. So between 2.3 billion and 3.2 billion today. And so, the idea that we cannot do reparations is false, because even Reagan, who a lot of people considered to be a racist president, signed this reparations bill for Japanese people. And also, this is something I didn't know, but North Carolina, because a lot of women were being sterilized in this country, as happened in Puerto Rico, they actually initiated a $10 million reparations program that should give the more than 177 living victims a range of $50,000 each. Again, it's not commensurate with what happened with them, right? So one of the victims, named Elaine Riddick Jesse, who was sterilized at the age of 14 after being raped and giving the resulting son up for adoption, put it, "If I accepted it, what kind of value am I putting on my life?" Well, she didn't accept this reparation because it was an insult. But the idea that we can't do reparations is extremely false. And even in the Tuskegee experiment, which we know they gave black men syphilis and then didn't give them treatment, a $10 million out of the court settlement with the victims was achieved in 1974, right? So this whole idea that we can't do reparations is false. And even for Rosewood, right? The state of Florida agreed to a reparations package worth around 3.36 million in 2014, and so on and on and on. This country has already done it, and also Germany paid $7 billion to survivors of the Holocaust. And the reasons they gave was, aside from the huge human rights abuses, what they said was compensation for the loss of loved ones and pain and suffering incurred, right? But also for unpaid wages, right? And lost income. So, all these people who say, oh, this has never been done, it can't be done. This is all documented. This reporter, his name is, and I'll tell you his name again. His name is Dylan Matthews. He wrote this article for Vox. Vox is an online news service on May 23rd, 2014. It even says the time, 11:20 a.m. And it just documents 6 examples, 4 in the US and 2 internationally, of people getting reparations for harm, for death, for loss of loved ones, for loss of income, for being forced to work without pay. So, this whole idea that reparations hasn't been done, can't be done, it doesn't match up to the research, to the data, and to the information. So what do y'all got to say on that?
Well, I mean, when you look at some of the reparations that you did talk about as it relates to African Americans, it was peanuts. It wasn't even pennies on the dollar. It was peanuts on the dollar. The United States have always given out reparations, whether it was the Japanese or assisting the Jews, getting a reparation from the France for the railway. They have always had a history of giving reparation out. And something Roger said earlier, it's just that when it comes down to us, they never seem to want to give us reparation. And the fallacy is that they contradict themselves. They accuse us of being lazy and unworthy by trying to put those monikers on us. But meanwhile, they stole us from our land, and is one of the reasons why they owe us reparation. And the labor, the manual labor, the division of the family that we still feel today, the bodily harm, the raping of our daughters and our wives and what have you. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. In the main reason that they're guilt, they have a conscience and they have a moral compass with everybody else, but with us, even when they wrote the laws, the Constitution, they didn't even classify us as a man. 3/5 of a man, but yet they thought we was man enough and women enough to become breeders, to do their manual labors, and then it never stops. There's always a cash chase with them. So they find money for everybody, but they find excuses. They find reasons for other people, and they find excuses why not to with us. But they have a history of co-opting with other people, encouraging other countries to pay reparations. Depends on what it is, just as long as it's not African American. And that's why we got to keep the pressure on them, regardless. I don't care who comes in, and they laud us and they thank us profusely. But then again, they want to turn their back to us, and they don't want to. They don't want to be viewed. They don't want to be the one. And the best place, I'm glad Roger's on, because a good example, good analogy is this. They don't want to be the one to say they gave those Negroes anything. The same way Bloomberg, with scientific evidence, the same way Donald Trump refused to look at the scientific evidence with COVID. Bloomberg, the same way with the Central Park Five. He said, basically, by his lack of movement, in it, said he's not going to get these brothers anything, even though they were never found guilty. None of his semen was found on them. Her boyfriend's semen was found on them. But I'm not going to pay him on my watch. So he just he's a microcosm of the United States. White people's feelings towards black people, regardless of what it is in the United States. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, the United States has systematically they developed the theory of white supremacy to justify the enslavement of Africans, because they call themselves Christians, and Christianity doesn't justify slavery. But if you're dealing with somebody who's less than human, then there's no contradiction in terms of enslaving them. So the whole concept of white supremacy came out of the economic imperative of enslaved labor, free labor. And it's that same underlying ideology that you can trace through the whole history of black people in this country, and also how it was implemented. I mean, white supremacy is that the indigenous were not white, they were eliminated. Black people were not white, we were enslaved. And even when formal slavery ended in 1865, a form of slavery continued, sharecropping, in terms of how we were treated. There's a book by an author, Douglas, and I always forget his name, out of Atlanta. He wrote a book called Slavery by Another Name. He's describing what happened after slavery. And when black people, they didn't provide 40 acres and a mule, they didn't provide any means of employment. They enacted these laws called black codes, which meant that if you were in an area and they said, and you didn't have a job, they would arrest you for being a vagrant, even though there were no jobs available. Arrest you for being a vagrant. Then they would lease you to anybody who needed work. And so the former plantation owners would just lease back these criminals. They're now called criminals because they didn't have a job, and they would lease them. And in some ways it was worse than slavery, because they would just work them to death and lease some more. At least under slavery, there was an incentive to continue to at least provide enough food and clothing so that your slave could get up the next day and work for you. Under under this convict leasing, there was no incentive. So people would just work to death, and then they would lease some more. So this continues all the way through to 2021 in terms of the systematic attack on our humanity, the effects it's had on our physical health, our mental health. But even with all that, under your previous segment on COVID, that whole question of underlying conditions that affect our community more, which is part of the residue, the relic of slavery. It's not simply the underlying conditions, it's the fact that we don't get the systematic care we need to address those conditions. So they can't say, well, blacks and Latinos, they die because they have underlying conditions. No, they die because we don't get the care we need to address the fact that there are underlying conditions. And so that's what we have to look at. And what reparations would do, what reparations does, is to address, reparations does is to provide hold on a second. What reparations does is to provide the funds for the transfer of wealth that we never got. It's to provide it helps us. Hold on a second.
Yeah. All right. Let's give him a little break here, Bill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Robert's comment. Sorry, Robert, we're giving you a little break so you could take care of that.
No. It was just a message saying the courts are going to be closed tomorrow. Everything's going to be virtual. But the point being, if we got the healthcare, the proper healthcare that we should, even with all of the underlying conditions we have, we wouldn't be dying like this. And so the question of reparations speaks to how to give us what we need to at least put us on an even playing field. And it's the debt. Once again, you don't get away from the fact that it's simply a debt that is due. It's long overdue. Right. And I don't know on this platform whether I can screen share. I mean, I have a short video, but I don't know this one. I don't know if this is like Zoom, so maybe
No,
not.
no. The thing is, like, for you to share on this, you have to email it to me, and then I could post it up.
Okay.
Uh, So, I mean, you could do that. I mean, we have enough time. It's 35. So, if I get it, I can put it in. But also, I wanted to, because what we do is we have audience participation from the chat, right? And so what we have here is a comment by Brother Robert. There was a financial incentive with Japanese reparations. The U.S. does so much business with Japan. Reagan's economic advisors understand the goodwill this would buy. So I think Robert's point, because I remember at one point the Japanese economy was ascending, right?
This is going like a rocket.
And so what Reagan did in order to solidify the relationship with Japan was that he instituted then reparations for the Japanese interned people. But also that whole Japanese economy was undermined because, unlike China, Japan is dependent on the United States for security and dependent on the United States for its armed forces. And so when the Japanese, it looked like they were going to overtake the U.S. economically, they undermined the Japanese economy, and now it's been in stagnation for over 10 years. But the problem they're having with China is that China doesn't depend on the U.S. for its military. It has its own nuclear weapons, has the People's Army in China. And so what they're left doing is trying to instigate first a trade war and then a hot war with China. But, so I appreciate that comment coming from Brother Robert.
And I think I would like to add, I think that's a very important comment because it speaks to that this wasn't altruistic in terms of the providing some form of reparation to the formerly interned U.S. citizens of Japanese descent. It was tied to the what they saw as their national and economic interests, and it's the same thought pattern when people say, how is it that in 1894 or 93, the U.S. Supreme Court could have a case that said separate but equal facilities are constitutional? Of course, we knew they were separate, but they certainly weren't equal. But that was the myth or the justification. But yet 60 years later, a Supreme Court of a different group of white men, but white men nevertheless, look at the same Constitution and come to a different conclusion that separate but equal is not constitutional. And that's when when Robert's question speaks to what happened in those 60 years. One was the level of resistance of Black people who had participated in 2 wars and were not going to take it, but also was the shift in the international arena, in that now the United States wanted to move in to the vacuum that was being created as the colonial countries who also were affected by World War II said, if we can fight for our colonizers, then we can fight for our own independence. Right. So the United States wanted to move into that market. And in order to move into that market, they had to distinguish themselves from the European colonizers. So they couldn't do that and still have a law in the books that said separate but equal is constitutional. So those are the factors that go into. They're never altruistic. They're tied to the international conditions. They're tied to the strength of the resistance in the domestic arena. So that's how we have to look at it, because then we understand what is it that can force the United States to address the question of reparations will be the strength of the movement on the ground here, and then also the international situation, which makes it necessary for them to pay attention to it. That those are the things that we have to look at when we're making an analysis of what's possible and what's not possible. What's not possible in one period of time becomes possible in another period of time simply because of those factors.
That's very important. Because a lot of times I talk to people who do organizing work, and there always seems to be this lack of connection between what's happening here and what's happening internationally. You know, like for example, I talk to some folks sometimes about Palestine, about Venezuela, and you know, because of my education with December 12th about Zimbabwe, and when I first approach them about it, they don't see that connection right away. You know what I'm saying? And so I'm glad you're raising that, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, like how does the privatization of NYCHA, public housing in the United States, and the rent evictions and all that, how that's connected to reparations and then what's happening internationally? Maybe you just speak a little bit more about that. And I know I put a lot on your plate, but you know, I think it's so important that you know, because every day we're caught up in what's happening to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of lose sight of all these pieces that are connected. So maybe, you know.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we do. I think that our struggle is how do we pull all these pieces together? Because, yeah, you do get caught up with, I'm dealing with housing, I'm dealing with education, I'm dealing with healthcare, I'm dealing with employment, as if they're not connected. And if you don't get to the linchpin of understanding what capitalism is, then you won't understand the different forms it takes in terms of how it messes with people. And then what is it that we have to pull together, excuse me, to address it. And so if we start from the understanding that we live in a society whose basic premise is you can never make enough money. You have to squeeze every penny you can out of every way you can. That maximum profit is what determines what we do, and anything else we do is based upon, will it affect our maximum profit? So left to their own devices, that's how they function. The limitations placed on them are the limitations based upon the old saying, where there's oppression, there's resistance. So it depends on the degree of the resistance of what Frederick Douglass said, that you can measure the limits of the oppression that people will take by how much they take. And once they begin to resist, the levels of oppression, lift to that also. So when we look at why is it that public housing that was set up in the mid 20th century is now being privatized? Because it's maximum profit. Mm-hmm. That the funds, the rents that people pay in public housing, once those buildings are privatized, they're going to be at a certain level for a certain time, and then they're going to get to what they call the open market. Once it hits a certain amount, then it's going to be the free market, because what they want is as much money from rentals as possible, even though there are people who are homeless, mm-hmm. even though they're building. In Brooklyn, it's like a building frenzy. They're throwing up buildings left and right. The zoning laws have been changed. The heights of the building are going up, and you go by them, and the buildings are finished, and you still see empty windows because people can't afford it. And then the people who do move into them, often it's 4 or 5 people in what should be a 1-bedroom because they can't afford it otherwise. And so that's the insanity of capitalism in terms of understanding what's happening. The point you made around China, one of the reasons that the U.S. can't deal with China is that China owns all U.S. notes. The U.S. has borrowed a whole bunch of money, and almost all of that, all their bonds and stuff are due. The Chinese if the Chinese called them in, the U.S. economy would collapse. So this is all in terms of the connection between the domestic and the international. You cannot, well, they said that old song, Love and Marriage, you can't have one without the other. That's necessary to us understanding what's going on.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to get that call, and I'm going to put up a comment by Jose. All right. So, Brothers Jose's comment is, how can we further popularize the just demand for reparations, and what would it look like concretely? I think that's a really, really good question. 5273. Right. Have a great day. All right. So let's put this down. Go ahead, Bill. You want to say something?
No, I mean, Roger's doing so good.
No,
I don't want to stop the flow.
Yeah.
Am I open?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
The demand for reparations is, that's why I wanted to, I'll try and show you this little video. You know, one of the things we don't control are the mass media, but I think we can make use of social media to get the word out to people around what it is, to explain what it is, to demystify what it is, to get away from the alternate facts around what it is. I think when we talk to people on the ground, most people say that makes sense, and they say, well, we deserve that. They just think that we can't get it. It just takes us back to the earlier part of our conversation. Yeah, that's true, but we can't get it. And it's like Harriet Tubman was supposed to have said that, you know, I freed hundreds of slaves, but I could have freed thousands more if they'd only known that they were slaves. It's the view that we can't do it. But, you know, we have to look at our history. People said you couldn't get rid of slavery, not just run away from slavery, but get rid of slavery. It couldn't be done until it was done. And how we popularize it, I think, is tied to our creativity, that we know we're not going to get a run on NBC or CBS that will consistently put forward that message. So that means that then we have to take it out to our people and in discussions, chats, library settings. For example, February 13th, we're going to have a webinar, a Zoom, around the question of reparations and this and the struggle that occurred in the United Nations back in 2001 to have an international body, the United Nations, declare the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as a crime against humanity. And that was a titanic struggle. But it was the first time that the United Nations or any international body recognized what had happened to us as a crime against humanity, which meant that in any court of law that recognizes international law, there's no statute. It's like there's no statute of limitations on murder. Well, there's no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity. And the reason that happened, over the opposition of the United States and all the Western European countries, all the former colonizers, was because of the organizations that, you know, the organizing that we did in some of the African countries. And so there was a film made called the Durban 400. And the Durban 400 was the name given to 400 people that we and the National Black United Front organized to go to the UN World Conference Against Racism in South Africa in 2001, because we understood that we had to have a tremendous lobbying force to help convince those countries, which wasn't all the countries except the Western countries, to have this historic declaration. So when people see that, and I'll get the link to folks so that you can send it out to folks. It's going to be at 2 p.m. on February 13th. It's a very, very powerful documentary, because what it says is something that people thought couldn't be done, could be done when folks got organized and did that. So that's in terms of Jose's question around how do we get the word out. We've got to tie it to the same creativity that we got our music out when they said we couldn't have drums in history. We always find a way to do that. What would it look like concretely? That's a question that no one has a definitive answer. You know, people have different views or positions around reparations. My view, the organization I belong to, the December 12th one's view, is that we suffered a collective crime, so that we need to have a collective repair. Not so much people getting individual checks, but the funding of an infrastructure that addresses what, like Mark said, our healthcare, the housing, employment, all the different ways we suffer. One, from having been the descendants of the victims of slavery, of having been the objects and the targets of institutional white supremacy, and also from being part of a class that is exploited in the United States as well. So that but reparations speaks to our particular, and so that's, I mean, when we talk about how that would look, it would begin to address those issues.
All right, thank you. So also, I just wanted to bring up what Robert follow up on. Like, you're right, the Chinese buy U.S. Treasury bonds. And so Robert's point is that because of that, then the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were funded through the Treasury bonds. And also, so he was listening very intently when you raised that issue of the Treasury bonds. And also Jackie, who's a warrior, a leader in the Fulton houses in Lower Manhattan. She wanted to go back to the issue of the privatization of housing, which is an important issue, which we mentioned here. Right now it's 8:51. We're running out of time, but she is such an important person in what we're doing in New York City that I was wondering if you wanted to address a little bit about this whole issue of, well, how do we stop this privatization if we know that is part of this capitalist, greedy, race for profits? I just had to raise it because she is such a fantastic warrior and leader. So what can you because we know you have many years of organizing experience. Right now we brought you on about reparations. But the wealth of knowledge that you and other people have can be really great to folks like Jackie who are leaders in their community. So what do you think? I mean, we could briefly discuss it.
It's going to be brief because I don't have the answer. I mean, I think it's got to be tied to people deciding that they're not going to be moved.
I agree with that.
There are things now where people come in and they're being evicted, and then people take the stuff up and put it back in there. So I think it's a concept of certain things that we're not going to agree to the extent that, and there's a program, it's called a RAD program, I think, in terms of NYCHA that deals with, I don't know the particulars of it, but we had a campaign about a year or two ago. It's a continuing campaign. We didn't call it gentrification, we call it ethnic cleansing, that particularly in Brooklyn. And so we picked a couple of places where they were, they had put in new buildings, forced old people out, and just had for almost a year, demonstrations there, which meant that they weren't able to sell the apartments, the condos, which meant that the developers were not able to get the money to pay off the banks that they had borrowed, which meant that it ended up costing them more. So it was like a war of attrition to make it unprofitable for the developers. And it was just one kind of battle. But if it became a general kind of thing, that will help do it. But I don't have the magic bullet around privatization, but know that it has to be resisted. And I know that's an inadequate answer. I apologize.
All right, thank you.
And it's not really an inadequate answer. I think that you're right, because a lot of times the things that you mentioned, and I appreciate what you brought to the table, a wealth of information from a variety of subjects. So I could just sit back. I think, like you see in the chat, a lot of people appreciate your knowledge and the fact that you're actually on the ground doing this thing. But I remember when I started off fighting for the school, one of the things that got them in the headlines is that one of the teachers sat down and refused to cooperate. She actually literally took your words to heart, and she didn't move. And then other teachers did that too. And what happened was they called the police. The news was called, and that started the ball rolling. And that's what you have to do. And no matter what we do, we always got to recreate ourselves. Because, I mean, look, they took Donald Trump off of Twitter and whatnot, and on Facebook and what have you. So now what are they talking about? They're talking about, you're talking about how we do it. We're not mainstream media. So we got to use something that best fits our pocket, our creativity. And that's social media. But now they're talking about Mark Zuckerberg talking about not using Facebook as a political platform. So every time we do something, we find a way. Anytime that we create a avenue, somehow it best suits them, even though we are the ones that created it. So we got to keep creating it. We will always create it because they forced that on us. So we just have to be up for the fight, and we have to plant our feet and say, you know what, we're not going to take it no more. And sometimes it's the simplest thing that starts the whole ball roll like an avalanche, just a small proverbial snowball. So I think you can give a scientific answer, like it was a college 101, but really sometimes it's within us. When people get sick and tired of taking something, it's just like the bully. You're getting bullied so much that he said, what the hell I got to lose? I'm just going to get beat up anyway. Maybe I swing and I get his respect, or maybe I win the fight. But just that simple act, that's all that is resistance. We just got to find the resistance in us. And you find it in one person, you get you a buddy system, and that's what you're doing. You just try to stack little victories and what have you. And like when Jackie was there on the 18th, the things that she said about the privatization of the Fulton houses and things, and she confronted Gail Brewer. And I wasn't aware of that, and I was able to confront Gail Brewer. And I told Jackie that, for instance, I had no problem because I know Gail. I remember before she was the borough president, and I had a history of with her. But we put her on the spot because I did go there, and she did kind of feel uncomfortable, and she gave me fluff, and I realized it was fluff. And I told Jackie, and it's a good time to mention it, that I would be glad to partner up with her, and that's how we have to do it. Simple as that. It's like you said, there's no silver bullet. It's just have to have the wherewithal and the intestinal fortitude to forge on. And that's one thing that I respect out of D12 is, what they were able to do. They didn't have 100 lines. Lambs. They had 10, 20 lines, and they did it. They kept going forward. So the same thing with what we're doing here, trying to mimic what works.
Right.
Thank you. So we also have Hector Luis Rivera Ortiz. Salute Queen Mother Moore, always present. And I responded because talking about reparations, I think that's a great salute right there. I don't know if you want to say anything on Queen Mother Moore, Roger, based on what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, Queen Mother Moore is part of that whole history of. There's a continuum. This is not something that Black people started struggling for today. It's from the time of the end of the Civil War. Black people were struggling for reparations, and Queen Mother Moore was a prime mover of that through the latter half of the 20th century. So if nobody who's struggling for reparations today can claim that they initiated it, they're, as always, we're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors. And Queen Mother Moore was a very, very, very important contributor to the struggle for reparations, and she came to embody it for a lot of people.
All right, thank you. So we're coming on 2 minutes, so we got a message from Sister Jackie. She says, thank you, guys. And Bill, she's going to take you up on that partner because she definitely, she was very impressed by your masterful emceeing on Dr. King National Day of Action. So she definitely going to take you up. But before we go to announcements, folks, are there any last words you want to give impart to our audience, Brother Roger?
Yeah. The this link you can send out to them. I sent it to you. I guess we probably don't have enough time now. But this idea of an executive order for President Biden to sign an executive order to place $50 billion down payment on reparations. The link that I sent Mark, I hope we can send it out to all the people who are viewing this. It's only about a minute and a half, and circulate it to people because we wanted to, Jose asked, how do we popularize it? It's getting the word out. And I think this video is a very good way of getting the word out and getting people thinking about reparations. So I would ask people to do that, and then let us know where you sent it to. We want to establish a network. We want to spread this out. So I want to thank you for inviting me. as always, I learn something when I do these things, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So maybe you can let us know again about February 13th, and
Yep,
then
I will.
I'll make a couple of announcements, and then we'll wrap it up. You can do that now.
Okay, February 13th, 2 p.m. We're going to be showing a showing of the Durban 400, which was the not completely unknown, the organizing effort that went into having the historic UN declaration that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery were crimes against humanity. So I'll get that to you. You can send it out to your list.
That's a webinar, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
I don't have the link for it yet.
Okay. Mark, only thing I really want to say, there's not really much in conclusion, but I do want to recognize a couple of our pioneers that made their transition. And one was my favorite ball player. That was Hank Aaron. My family basically was Willie Mays fans. I like Willie Mays, but for some reason I just was more drawn to Hank Aaron.
Me too.
I mean,
both.
Yeah, well, that must be a February thing, bro. Okay. So the grace that he carried himself. And one of the things that he brought out is, when he was embarking on the quote unquote hollow record, the untouchable 714 mark, how it should have been a great time in his life. And how it really wasn't. And I remember also when he gave the Atlanta Braves all those years, and they started that season on the road, and the racist commission that Brewery Kuhn was, and he showed this time and time again. He ordered that Hank Aaron had to play on the road. He couldn't sit and make that extra gate for the home fans in Atlanta. So I want to recognize him because he came from the Negro League. And I could go deeper on that with the Negro League as far as, how I feel about that. But I also want to recognize Cicely Tyson. I remember it's 1972. I was 12 years old. And the movie Sounder came out. And she I mean, that was really kind of a first introduction for a lot of people with cornrow. But she was a pioneer in her own right. But what did they do when Bo Derek came out with the movie Chin, I think it was? They called it the Bo Derek look. We always have to recreate ourselves. They're always stealing from us. There's only two types of people in the world. There's imitators and originators. So, and the grace that she always held herself in. And I mean, even though her name was Cicely Tyson, sometimes I call her Miss Jane Pittman, because there's a line in that movie when she was doing the interview and she would just stop talking. And the white reporter that was following the story, the lady, the family member said, well, Miss Jane Pittman sometimes don't say bye. She said so many in her life that she don't feel the need to say anymore. So I just want to shout them two out.
All right, thank you. And just with announcements, on Saturday, March 13th, the People's United Front, Frente Unido del Pueblo, has a People's 10 demands, and one of the demands is reparations. It's going to have a virtual anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-sexist conference that day. The morning will be for discussion, to talk about what's happening, and then there's going to be a break in midday, and then in the afternoon it'll be about planning for a May Day, National Day of Action, again in Baltimore, Detroit, Los Angeles, New Orleans, New York City. And so that's going to be happening on Saturday, March 13th during Women's History Month. So the presenters and the keynote speakers will all be women. The brothers will focus on the technical work and providing the support for the conference to go well. And then on, of course, so that's part of our national coalition, which is called the People's United Front, Frente Unido del Pueblo. And so we want to thank everybody who came out tonight, participated in the chat, or just listened and tuned in on Facebook and YouTube. And I want to thank Brother Roger again for coming on and the December 12th movement. And so we're going to end. Bill, you want to end it for us?
Yeah. What just says the affirmation or
however the spirit moves you, brother.
you threw me. You threw. Okay, hey, listen. I'll say this real quick. It was a pleasure, Roger, big brother, to hear you. To talk truth to power. I mean, it's necessary, and hopefully, some people that just like channel service, just happen chance tune in. Hopefully, it erodes something in them, and they'll do their own research and they'll stay with us and join the organization. If it's not this organization, join another organization, or even create your own organization. But be a part of something because we're stronger together than we are divided. And with that, I say, power to the people.
All power to
People.
the people. All right. All power to the people. Good
More
night.
power to the people.
Thank you.